David Grohl and the rest of the Foo Fighters star in Studio 666, where they fight demons in a haunted house. But does this movie rule, or will it be forgotten everlong? Find out here on the Beniverse. My name is Ben Friedman. Welcome back to the Beniverse, and thank you for joining me today. Today I am talking about the newest released horror comedy Studio 666, which stars David Grohl, the rest of the Foo Fighters as themselves, in a horror comedy where the Foo Fighters record their 10th studio album in what ends up being a haunted house, and shenanigans and horror ensue. This movie is inspired by a story that David Grohl came up with. It stars the Foo Fighters along with Jeff Garlin, Whitney Cummings, and Will Forte. Let me just get this out of the way. I'm a pretty big Foo Fighters fan, so when I came into this movie, I was kind of hoping for a movie that was similar in vein to when the Beatles did their movies in the 60s. Something that was just a little bit of a lighthearted look into the band with comedic sensibilities. And for the most part, I was happy with this movie. I thought it was good. Ultimately, I left this movie wanting just a little bit more from its story, because I think there was a lot that worked in this movie, but there's just some story beats that fall really flat. Now, let me just get some stuff out of the way. There's some obvious things that when you're going into a Foo Fighters movie that you hope that they would have. One of them is really good music. And let me just say, the soundtrack and score for this movie is awesome. Now, I wish Foo Fighters either had produced a few more original songs for this, or had at least played more of their best hits or albums throughout the movie. There is kind of a lack of Foo Fighters songs, but the music that is played in the heavy rock throughout the score is really good. I got to see this movie in an empty theater, so the sound was really clear, good, and it was shaking my seat. So that was a really cool experience. Throughout, there are a few really killer metal tracks in there, in particular one that is composed, I believe, by David Grohl and the rest of the Foo Fighters, is really heavy metal, something that I haven't heard from them in a while. So that was a really cool experience just to be in the theater hearing that for the first time. That was something that definitely elevated this movie for me. However, some of the issues that I had with this movie is that the Foo Fighters are kind of inconsequential to their own movie. It felt like it could have been any heavy metal band just simply replaced, and it wouldn't have changed the overall story. I wanted it to be more singularly focused on Foo Fighters and maybe drop a little bit more of references to their music. There were a few things when I watched the trailer and then going into the movie that really surprised me. One, the horror is prevalent in this film, and it's very well designed. There are some legit scares in this movie. There are some great little background details that really just elevate the horror. For instance, there's this one point where there's this statue that kind of just casts this hand shadow in the background, which kind of makes it look like a zombie's hand rising out from the grave. It's little details like that that really added to the atmosphere of this haunted house and really just brought forth the tension throughout this. And let me say with that as well, there is some really gnarly horror imagery throughout. The demons in this film are particularly really scary and well designed. I was impressed with how low of a budget this film was, how good it looked for a lot of the horror scenes, and how genuinely frightening some of these scenes throughout the movie were. In a movie like this, you expect there to be some deaths and kills, and they are over the top, brutal, ridiculous in this movie. I had a lot of fun with them. There's one kill in particular with a chainsaw that is better than any of the kills in the latest Texas Chainsaw Massacre installment. This over-the-top tone actually also comes to play with some of my issues with this film. This film is tonally inconsistent. It switches between comedy and horror a bit too rapidly. Some of the characters and people in the band, they play it completely straight, while others are completely tongue-in-cheek. Characters like David Grohl and Will Forte stand completely in juxtaposition to each other, and it feels like they're in two different movies. And to be honest, I preferred the movie David Grohl was in. Will Forte, while really funny in this movie, it feels like actors like him, Jeff Garlin, they're in a movie that is very comedic and very self-referential, where the Foo Fighters are just playing themselves in a horror movie. I preferred what the Foo Fighters were doing in this movie because I thought it was a little bit more interesting, and the self-referential humor worked a bit when the characters were kind of stone dead serious throughout. Speaking of David Grohl in this film, I was really surprised what a good screen presence he had. I've seen him in interviews before, and I know he's super charismatic, but I wasn't expecting to like him as much as I did as a leading man. I wouldn't call his performance particularly well refined. However, what I did find that he brought was this over-the-top presence and kind of hamminess, while also being able to play completely serious in a way that suited the film. He kind of reminded me of a young Jack Black or maybe a Danny McBride in the tone that he was bringing, which balanced comedy and seriousness really well. It never felt like he was making a farce of the movie he was in, but it was also enough to let him let loose and have fun with the source material. So I was really impressed with what he brought. Saying that, though, some of the members of the Foo Fighters cannot act. And for this movie, it was fine. I didn't need them to do a lot. But there were a few scenes where it's just like, oh, I really wish the director had either cut around that or had just been able to give them less to say so that their line delivery wasn't as noticeable in this film. Because there are a few members in particular, Pat, I believe is his name, that was just kind of brutal to watch. I mean, the good thing about this was their chemistry as a band was really good because they're a real life band. So they actually had a friendship and camaraderie that you bought into this movie. The biggest issues I had with this movie all regard its story, but more specifically the tone of the story. It tries to be self-referential, like let's say a movie like This Is the End with Seth Rogen in its supporting cast, but then like I said, its main cast is treating this like a very serious, straightforward movie where it is the Foo Fighters in a horror movie. They're not joking around, and that kind of came off more of like a Jeff Zucker's Airplane, where the comedy is happening around the main characters, but the main characters stay stoic. That is what I liked about this film when it was focused on the Foo Fighters. When characters like Jeff Garlin, Will Forte, Whitney Cummings appear, it just becomes a little bit too far-fetched. And speaking of far-fetched, the biggest issue I had with this film was in its third act, because this film's about 2 hours. For the first hour, I was pretty invested with this movie. I thought they hit a pretty good tone. It was a little jumpy, but ultimately I liked it. In the third act, everything kind of falls apart. One, it's a little too long. It needed to be edited down a little bit. It does the thing where it has multiple endings where it's like, okay, that's the stopping point. Okay, now that's clearly the stopping point. Okay, that's it. And then we get to the actual stopping point. They didn't need the twists and turns that this film took. So I wish they had really focused on ending it singularly. There's certain characters and story beats that appear throughout the film where it's clear that they're setting up something, but it never really pays off, and you don't really get a knowledge of why it happens in the film. What is left is something that is overly ridiculous and just doesn't serve the overall story of this film. I think this movie is going to work for fans of the Foo Fighters. I think there's enough good music. I think the Foo Fighters are charismatic, and I think the story is fun enough. What disappointed me was I did see something a little bit more. Had they just tightened up elements of the story, had they made sure the tone was consistent with everyone in the film, had they focused more on the main cast and a little less on these supporting comedic characters, I think this film ultimately would have benefited from all of those. Where I'm left with this film is I found it entertaining yet forgettable, which was really sad. I really wanted this movie to feel like a cult classic, just one where it's fans of the Foo Fighters, this is that movie that you talk about. Or even in something in similar of a vein of Pick of Destiny, with Tenacious D, some of the elements become too far-fetched that you lose a sense of reality, which I thought the first half of this film had. It started off strong but overstayed its welcome. But there is a lot of enjoyment to be had. There are some laughs in this movie that had me laughing really hard in the theater. David Grohl is a really entertaining presence, and I'd like to see him appear more as a comedic supporting character in actual films. Gave him maybe like a Judd Apatow director doing what Judd did with LeBron James, with having Grohl in that type of role. I think that'd be really cool to see him come up because he did have a really charismatic screen presence. Ultimately, Studio 666 was a okay movie that I really wish could have been better, and I think could have been a much better film. So with that, that's my review. Thank you guys for listening. Make sure to check out the Beniverse on Instagram, Twitter. Make sure to like and subscribe here, and thank you guys for listening.